Welcome back. When a person has lost a loved one, they need support from family and friends. But COVID-19 regulations make it difficult for this to happen. Now, being alone at such a painful and emotional time might lead to feelings of loneliness and depression. Well, let's discuss now how one can deal with grief during these challenging times. We chat now to clinical psychologist Malinka van der Berg. Malinka, very good morning, and thanks so much for your time. And I think you were able to hear my chat with my colleague Neba there, who's literally just heard of a close relative who has passed on, and you know, just much of what he was describing and just how it has changed him. I mean, just your thoughts on that. And you know, he's lucky enough to be a little stronger than other people, but that's not necessarily, you know, how everybody feels at this point. How do people deal with loss like that?
I think if I listen to clients at this stage, something that's making the grief even more compounded, even more difficult than it is already, is the fact that they can't go to the hospital. So if a family member is admitted to hospital, they can't go to say goodbye. So now they can't say goodbye, they can't greet the person, which already makes it difficult for them. So that first part of the grieving process, that denial, it's like even more difficult to get through it because it feels so unreal. And now with social distancing and not being able to see each other, we're almost used to the person not being there. So that denial part just goes on so much longer. And now you at home, you're hopefully if you're living with somebody, that at least gives some distraction. But a lot of people at this stage are living alone. So you're alone at home with just your thoughts. And some people have lost their jobs, so they don't have that distraction, or they were working from home. So there's no change of scenery. They're not necessarily able or feel safe to go to the gym or to go exercise. So exercise, which is a very big part of physically helping with the grieving process, is also taken away. So it makes all parts more difficult.
Well, you speak about sort of the physical aspects of actually letting off steam, I suppose, or just like we had Neba say, he plays squash, forgetting just for, you know, an hour maybe or a couple of minutes that this is what has happened to you. I was watching a documentary the other day, Malinka, about the mind-body connection and how emotions affect us physically, how emotions have the power, you know, to sort of make us develop some kind of illness or sitting with these emotions. And I would imagine that grief is such a big one. It really is such a big one. How can something like this, if you're not dealing with it properly, affect you physiologically, affect you physically?
So when we grieve, with any type of loss, so like Akishni said at the beginning of the episode, that loss isn't only death, but I think death is like the most intense experience of loss. Your thoughts are affected, your emotions are affected, and your body is affected. And when we lose somebody, when we go through grief, we tend to lose our appetite. So there's a change in appetite. So either people start eating a lot, or they normally lose their appetite completely. They battle to sleep because they can't switch off their brain. So now you're exhausted, you can't sleep. When you do sleep, a lot of people dream about the person they've lost. And a lot of times, especially at the beginning or shortly after the loss, the dreams are very vivid and they're quite dramatic. So it's not, or traumatic rather. So it's not even a nice dream, it's more a nightmare. So you're exhausted, you're not eating. And that then is just, that's a recipe for disaster, because now physically, your body is busy ailing away, and you're not getting the nutrition you should, you're not getting the sleep you should. So physically it has a huge impact. And at the beginning you asked, when should you go for help? A lot of times this then, especially if there's a comorbid condition like blood pressure or diabetes, those conditions then tend to spike because now you're not eating the way you should, so the diabetes takes over again. Or with the stress and with the pain of the loss, the blood pressure goes up a lot. So the loss, the grief then actually becomes a physical illness in the individual going through the grieving process, which then complicates the grieving process even more because now you're physically ill as well. And
We also spoke of those, yes, of course, who aren't able to say goodbye, even though they are here, they're close by, those who are abroad and have lost, close family members and not been able to say goodbye. What about, let's just get a bit more specific. What about those who have, unfinished business maybe with the person who has passed on? Maybe there was a regret, maybe there was an argument, mums and daughters, dads and sons, or sisters who had a little bit of an argument. Normally you wouldn't pay much attention, you get over it in a couple of weeks. What if many have had to deal or are dealing with that now, where they weren't able to resolve certain conflicts? How do you factor that into grief? How do you deal with that while dealing with your loss as well?
So one of the normal emotions people go through in grief is guilt feelings. So feeling I should have done more, I should have spent more time with the person. So guilt in general is a normal reaction to loss. But I think now, if you look at grief, there are a lot of compounding factors. And one of the compounding factors with COVID is a lot of the deaths tend to be quite sudden. So either the person was getting better and then suddenly passed away, or they weren't really sick. I was reading an article yesterday about a person who was fine and then the next morning he passed away. So there isn't time to apologize, where a lot of times when people are admitted to hospital, it's almost like a wake-up call to families and friends to say, listen, you need to finish the unfinished business. Now the loss is so sudden, there isn't time to finish that unfinished business. So that makes the grief even more complicated. And they talk about complicated or prolonged grief. And that is when the symptoms of grief don't get lighter. So in six months after the person passed away, you expect the symptoms, so the sadness, the guilt, the denial, the depression, the symptoms to get lighter. But with prolonged or complicated grief, after 6 months, it's almost like the person is stuck. It's that inability to move on and to function in their everyday life. So the inability to actually to apologize for things that they've done wrong just complicates it even more. So it just increases the probability of complicated grief developing and not being able to that easily go through the normal grieving process and get to acceptance and move on.
And wade through that tsunami of emotions, I suppose. Now, Malinka, we spend a lot of time talking about those who are grieving, those who've experienced that immediate loss, and we talk about the support they need. Let's spare a thought for those who have to provide that support, whether you're a friend of somebody, whether you're a distant relative, whether, that person who has to provide that support. You're taking on all of this. Somebody might be sort of the person, the go-to person for many people who've lost several, and you're absorbing all of this. You're the one who's trying to help them through all of this. Just a word about those people and how they should cope. You can't say, I can't be here for you right now. I'm dealing with somebody else and somebody else. And I find very few people might be able to say that. How should they cope with all of this?
So it's difficult to support somebody who's going through grief because there isn't really anything you can do or say that's going to take away their pain. Each person has to go through their grieving process and through their pain. So a lot of times the people supporting the person who's lost somebody will get anger and maybe even resentment from the person going through the pain. Make statements like, you don't understand what I'm going through, don't act like you know what I'm going through. So it's sometimes very difficult to be the one who's supporting. And I think at this stage with COVID, I don't think anyone has not been touched by a type of loss, even if it hasn't been losing someone but loss of job, loss of normality, loss of routine. So everyone, I think, at this stage is battling with their own losses. So to support people at this stage through their loss, I think is even more difficult than it normally is. So if you are a friend or a family member of someone who has lost someone, reach out, be there for them. Even if they don't want to talk, make sure they know you are there for them. Send a WhatsApp, send an SMS, send an email, make a phone call. If they don't want to talk, then you do that again tomorrow. Just for them to know you are there. When they are ready, they'll reach out. So I think a lot of times what happens is in the grieving process, immediately after the loss, there's a lot of support. But then people go on with their lives and the person who has gone through the loss is very isolated. So keep on making sure that person knows you're there for them. And in that way, when they are ready, they know where a safe place is that they can call and just let go.
All right, Malinka van der Berg, thank you so much for that. Some help for everybody involved in the process of grief in the time of COVID-19. Very important takeaways. Allow yourself to grieve, allow yourself to go through the various processes, but also be honest about that point where you realize that you are just not coping. Condolences to everybody out there who is going through this process at the moment, who has lost somebody. Our hearts go out to you. That's where we leave it for today. Goodbye.